Judge Sarah Taylor sat steadily behind the bench, the familiar sounds of the courtroom swirling around her, the rustling of lawyers preparing papers, the hushed whispers of spectators, and the distant echo of a gavel striking in another chamber. Yet today felt different. Sarah was a seasoned judge, having presided over thousands of cases, but today she couldn't shake the weight in her chest. It was all because of the name Marcus James. Sarah looked up as the case was called. The state of Texas versus Marcus James? The name hit her like a punch to the gut. Marcus was no stranger. She had known him since childhood in Houston, Texas. They had been close friends, sharing dreams of a different life. But the man standing before her now was not the same boy she once knew. He had changed, lost the dreams they once had, and now all that was left was a man carrying the scars of a hard life and a constant battle with a system that had failed him. Sarah felt her gaze lock onto Marcus as he entered the courtroom, his eyes a mix of surprise and resignation. She couldn't forget the memories of growing up together. Now they stood on opposite sides in the most tragic of circumstances. Sarah knew this wasn't just a case, it was a battle with her past. Sarah's mind raced as the courtroom buzzed with the usual chaos. The lawyers stood at their tables, shuffling papers, preparing their arguments, while the audience whispered in hushed tones. But none of it registered. Her focus was on Marcus. The man standing before her, shackled and silent, was a far cry from the boy she had known. The memories hit her like a flood, raw and unrelenting. Growing up in Houston, Sarah and Marcus had been inseparable. They spent lazy summer afternoons racing bicycles down dusty streets, their laughter echoing in the air. They shared late-night talks under the sprawling oak in her backyard, the world at their feet and dreams bigger than the small town they called home. They had made promises that no matter what life threw at them, they would always have each other's backs. It was a bond forged in innocence in the hope of a better future. But somewhere along the way that hope had crumbled. The streets of Houston weren't kind to people like Marcus. The unspoken lines of segregation, the differences in skin color and background, those things weighed heavy on both of them, even if they hadn't fully understood it back then. That was before the world had pulled them apart. Sarah's father had made it clear. Marcus wasn't welcome in their house. One summer evening, the two of them had been sitting on the porch talking about the future when her father had caught them. His voice had been cold, sharp with authority as he ordered Sarah inside, forbidding her from seeing Marcus again. Sarah had hesitated, a lump forming in her throat as she glanced at Marcus. He had only nodded, his voice quiet but resigned. "I'll see you around," he had said, and just like that everything changed. Sarah had never seen him the same way again. Her life had taken her down a different path, far away from Houston. She'd thrown herself into her studies, eventually becoming a lawyer and then a judge, driven by a desire to change the system that had torn her and Marcus apart. But now, as she watched him standing in front of her in shackles, she couldn't escape the question that haunted her. What had happened to Marcus? How had their lives diverged so completely? The man before her wasn't a criminal, at least that's not how she remembered him. But the law had no room for personal history, and Sarah knew she had a job to do. The system demanded it. Yet, her heart ached with the knowledge that somehow the truth might never fully surface. As Sarah sat at the bench, the weight of the gavel in her hand felt heavier than it ever had before. The courtroom had become a blur, voices blending together, the rustle of papers, the cold hum of the fluorescent lights above her. She couldn't focus on anything but Marcus. His face, so familiar and yet so foreign, haunted her thoughts. She had known him as a boy full of promise, a boy who had dreamed of leaving Houston and escaping the suffocating grip of their segregated world. But the man in front of her now, the one accused of robbery and assault, was a stranger in many ways. His shoulders hunched with defeat, his eyes a mixture of anger and resignation. How had they both ended up here? The trial proceeded, but Sarah's mind kept drifting. The prosecutor's voice echoed in the background, describing the alleged crime with clinical detachment. He spoke of Marcus allegedly robbing a convenience store, attacking a clerk in the process. The evidence seemed damning. Marcus had been found just blocks away from the scene, the stolen cash allegedly in his possession. Yet Sarah couldn't shake the doubt gnawing at her. Could the man in front of her really be capable of such violence? Could the system, the same system she had dedicated her life to, truly see him as a criminal without understanding the full picture? Her heart pounded as she glanced at the jury, their faces a mix of skepticism and uncertainty. Sarah knew she had to remain impartial, but the years of memories, the years of friendship with Marcus, weighed on her conscience. Could she separate the man he had become from the boy she had once known? She couldn't help but wonder how much of his past had shaped the man standing before her now, How much of the struggle, the abandonment, the prejudice had pushed him to this point? The courtroom felt suffocating, the walls closing in on her as she tried to reconcile the professional distance she was supposed to maintain with the personal connection she had to this case. The trial wasn't just about evidence, it was about people, about lives shaped by forces beyond their control. And in that moment, Sarah realized that perhaps justice wasn't always as simple as following the law. Maybe it was about understanding, about looking beyond the surface to see the story of a person, the story of Marcus. The days of the trial dragged on, and with each passing moment, Sarah felt the weight of her position growing heavier. She had long prided herself on her ability to remain impartial, to view each case with the detached precision of a judge. But this was different. This wasn't just another criminal defendant standing before her. This was Marcus. The boy who had once been her best friend, the boy she had promised to stand by, now stood in front of her as an accused criminal. Her heart wavered, the lines between the law and her personal feelings blurring in ways she hadn't anticipated. The defense had presented its case, and the cracks in the prosecution's story were starting to show. Officer Harris, the arresting officer, had testified that Marcus fit the vague description of a suspect. Dark clothing, mid-40s, black male, but there was no concrete evidence linking Marcus to the crime. No red hoodie was found in his possession, no clear identification from witnesses. Yet, the prosecutor had relentlessly pushed forward, as though the absence of evidence didn't matter. It was a frustrating, maddening display of how the system often worked. A system that seemed to focus more on assumptions and stereotypes than on seeking real truth. As the defense continued to pull apart the prosecution's case, Sarah couldn't ignore the rising anger inside her. How many times had she seen this before? The way the system quickly labeled people based on their appearance, their race, their background. How many lives had been lost to these assumptions? Marcus was just one more example, a casualty of a system that seemed more interested in maintaining its status quo than in finding justice. She wanted to stand up, to shout out, to demand more from the system she had sworn to uphold, but she couldn't. Her role was to observe, to judge impartially, and yet it felt like she was drowning in the contradictions. The trial came to a head when Marcus took the stand. His voice, raw and filled with emotion, broke through the cold, sterile atmosphere of the courtroom. He didn't deny his past mistakes. He didn't pretend to be perfect. But he wasn't guilty of this crime. "I've been fighting my whole life to be seen as more than what people assume about me," he said, his words hanging in the air. Sarah's throat tightened, and for a moment she wasn't a judge in a courtroom. She was just a woman who had once known this man, a woman who couldn't help but feel the deep, aching truth in his plea. Her gaze met his, and for the first time in days the courtroom fell silent. She knew then that this wasn't just a case, it was a reckoning. A reckoning for Marcus, yes, but also a reckoning for the system that had failed him long before he ever set foot in that convenience store. And as the trial came to a close, Sarah felt the weight of her duty pressing on her shoulders, knowing that no matter the verdict, the true battle for justice was far from over. The final day of the trial dawned, and Sarah stood at her bench, a heavy silence settling over her as the jury deliberated. Her heart was racing, each tick of the clock echoing like a drumbeat in her chest. The prosecutor and defense attorney had given their closing arguments, and the weight of it all, the lies, the biases, the unspoken truths, hung in the air. As much as Sarah tried to remain impartial, to bury her emotions beneath her black robes, she couldn't escape the growing sense of injustice that had taken root in her soul. The system that she had once believed in so fiercely, the system that was supposed to be fair, to be just, had betrayed Marcus, and in some ways, it had betrayed her too. The trial had become more than a question of guilt or innocence. It had become a battle of conscience. The evidence was circumstantial, the witnesses unreliable, and yet the room buzzed with an underlying current of certainty that Marcus was guilty, simply because of who he was. It was a sickening realization, one that Sarah couldn't shake. How many more lives would be sacrificed to these same assumptions? How many people would continue to be swallowed by a system more interested in maintaining order than in seeking truth? As the jury finally returned with their verdict, Sarah's stomach tightened. She had hoped, against all odds, that they would see the flaws in the case, that they would recognize the humanity of Marcus and the holes in the prosecution's argument. But when the jury foreperson stood up, the words, "not guilty," rang out in the courtroom like a shot fired through the stillness. A wave of relief washed over Sarah, but it was tempered with a bitter taste in her mouth. Marcus was free, yes, but at what cost? The trial had exposed the cracks in the justice system, cracks that had long been ignored, and for the first time, Sarah wondered if the system could ever truly be fixed. As Marcus signed his release paperwork, their eyes met across the room. There was no triumph in his gaze, no joy in the victory. Only a quiet, profound understanding. And Sarah, standing there in her black robes, the gavel in her hand, knew that this moment wasn't just the end of a trial. It was the beginning of something much larger. For the first time she felt the full weight of her position, not as a judge but as someone who could and perhaps should do more. As the courthouse emptied and the doors closed behind her, Sarah made a silent promise. She would fight. Not just for Marcus but for everyone who had ever been caught in the gears of a system that had failed them. She had upheld the law, yes, but now it was time to change it. The days following the trial were filled with a heaviness that clung to Sarah like a second skin. Marcus was free, but the victory felt hollow in her chest, a temporary respite from a truth she couldn't escape. She had upheld the law, yes, but it had come at a cost that she wasn't sure she was prepared to face. In the quiet of her chambers, long after the courtroom had emptied, Sarah thought about the consequences of her actions. The decision to let the system play out, to trust that justice would prevail despite everything that was broken within it. Marcus had been granted freedom, but what about the countless others like him, lost in the cracks of a system that was never designed for them? She could hear his words in her mind, "The world's never been fair, not for people like me." They echoed in her heart, a constant reminder of the battle she hadn't even realized she was fighting until it was too late. Sarah's gaze drifted to the window, where the setting sun cast long shadows across the courthouse steps. It was a symbol of the world outside her walls, an imperfect, harsh world where people like Marcus had to fight for every ounce of dignity, while others were afforded it by default. The justice system had failed him, and in many ways, it had failed her too. But now, as she looked toward the future, Sarah felt a flicker of something new within her, a determination to do more than just serve the law. She would work to change it. For Marcus, for those still trapped in a system of injustice, for herself. The battle wasn't over, not by a long shot. The real fight for fairness and equality was just beginning. And this time she wasn't going to look away. The story of Sarah and Marcus is a powerful reminder of the injustices that exist within our legal system and society. The key lesson here is that sometimes, the system we trust isn't always fair, and not everyone gets an equal shot at life. However, it's people within that system, like Sarah, who can bring about change. This shows us that we must stay alert and constantly question the injustices around us, not only to protect the oppressed but also to find ways to change the imperfect system. The advice for us is not to shy away from standing up when we witness injustice, and to always remember that the actions of one individual can make a difference. Always believe in the power of change even though the road may be difficult.